What we're going to do real quick, I'm going to cover the context just very briefly, mainly because we have a long chapter ahead of us today, and I would rather spend more time in the context. I'd rather spend more time in the chapter than in the context, and so I will cover this rather than having a bunch of us do it. I'll cover it real quick, and we'll be able to get through it. So we've been in the book of 1 Samuel, but really the main thing you need to know is that we have lately been in the life of David. Not me, David, a much cooler David than I am. A David who is a man after God's own heart. And we know that about him prior to him ever being introduced into the story. From 1 Samuel chapter 13, we know that this guy is going to be a man after God's own heart, and he doesn't even show up on the scene until chapter 16. So he shows up, and whenever we see David, we are supposed to figure out what is it about this guy that sets him apart from everybody else. And we've kind of been tracking him. At this time in Israel, they're kind of in a weird place where they're kind of trying to be devoted to God, but at the same time they want to be like the other nations, and so they've asked for a king, and currently there is a king like the nations above them, and his name is Saul, that God has appointed, but he is not a very good king. He is more of a tyrant, and David rises through the ranks. He kills Goliath, and he has all this amazing stuff happen to where he basically becomes the number one stud in all Israel, where everybody just wants to be around David. Really likable, charismatic guy. People love him. But Saul recognizes that's a problem for him. And David, keep in mind, has this promise from God that he will become king. And so he knows for a fact that he's going to end up on the throne one day. And so he really doesn't have any desire to force his way there. And it kind of seems like he might not even necessarily care for the idea of being on the throne. Really, whenever I read the story, it seems like David is just going to be king because God wants him there. Whereas, personally, it seems like David was actually much more content whenever he was just a shepherd, and he was kind of a nobody. But David is kind of thrust by God into this position, and as a result, Saul turns against David, and for the last few chapters, we have seen David on the run. Basically, on the run from Saul. In the last chapter, we saw a particularly cool moment where we really got to see David at his very, very best. Basically, David and some of his men are hiding away in a cave, and King Saul shows up in that very same cave, has to use the restroom, and everybody sees this as an opportunity for David to step in and wipe out the guy who's been trying to kill them. But David doesn't do that. He would never touch Saul. Even though Saul's trying to kill him, David says, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to kill Saul. If I'm going to end up on the throne, God's going to have to put me there. I'm not going to do anything to touch the Lord's anointed. Really cool stuff. So what he does is he cuts off a little piece of Saul's garment, and he waves it in front of Saul and says, hey, I could have killed you, but I didn't. So maybe you need to recognize that all of the things that you're thinking that I have against you are totally wrong. And Saul kind of repents, and Saul says, that's entirely my bad. I am sorry. Maybe we can be friends again. And David says, you know what? How about you go your way? I'm going to hang out here for a little bit, because it's evident that David thinks that maybe Saul isn't as repentant as he makes it seem. And sure enough, that will be the case. But in this chapter, we're not actually talking about Saul. Saul is going to be mentioned, I think, at the very end of the chapter. But Saul isn't really that prominent in this one, because we have a nice little reprieve where David is actually chilling out a little bit more, because Saul is kind of off his neck for a little bit. But David's still going around doing his whole Robin Hood thing, right? I've talked about how even though David's a fugitive and he's on the run, he's kind of got his merry men, and they're going around just helping people out. And that's the context of what we're going to see right here. We're going to see this particular story, which is an interesting contrast to the last chapter. Because the last chapter saw David at his very best, and this chapter is where we're going to see David with some of the cracks in the system. Where we know that David's a man after God's own heart, but he's still a man. And in this chapter, we're going to see certain things about David that are not necessarily the most holy, most amazing things. It's definitely not equivalent to the Bathsheba moment that we're going to get to in 2 Samuel, but it is at least notable to where we're going to be like, oh, this is just a guy who has the same type of struggles that we all face. But I think at the same time, we're still going to see how he is a man after God's own heart, even amidst all this. Because we're going to have to see how he responds to his own sinfulness. And I think it's really cool. So there's the context. Any questions? Okay. Well, let's start off with the most optimistic, joyful verse in the entire book. Now Samuel died, and all Israel assembled and mourned for him, and they buried him in his house at Ramah. I was joking when I said that. It was an optimistic and happy start to the chapter, because that's really sad. And honestly, normally I read a lot more at one time, but that verse right there kind of stands right on its own, and we're going to move on to a totally different story. What's going on there?
Well, Samuel died.
Yes, Samuel. So who is Samuel, real quick? Because I didn't really say anything about Samuel, but the book is literally named after him. Who's Samuel?
The last judge.
Yes, Samuel's the last judge. What's his significance?
The best priest. I think one of their best priests in their history. Besides Jesus.
Well, he is a priest, but more significantly, he's also a prophet. Right? He's like the last judge, which we spent a lot of time in the book of Judges. We know that whole story there. So Samuel is the last judge, but he's also kind of the first big-time prophet. I mean, technically anybody who writes a book of the Bible or speaks on behalf of God is a prophet. So Abraham was a prophet. Moses was a prophet. But Samuel literally, he was known as the prophet. He traveled around doing prophet things. He's a really significant guy. And we saw, basically, he was the one leading Israel up until the time they asked for a king. And so, with Samuel's death, we kind of have the end of an era, right? When Samuel dies, the period of the judges has officially come to an end. And this is kind of a sad moment, right? I mean, we've been with Samuel since his birth, right? This is literally how the book of Samuel started out. 25 chapters ago, the book opened up with a woman on her knees crying, asking God for a son. And Samuel was that child. And now here we are, 25 chapters in, and that child has grown up, and he has been faithful to God the whole way through. He led a massive revival, and ultimately the people rejected him because they wanted to be like the nations. And so for the last few decades, he's kind of just been, rejected by the people, going around. He anointed David, but it seems like the end of his life was kind of a sad one. I mean, even whenever God came to tell him to go anoint David, do you remember how he started off that conversation in chapter 16?
He was afraid of Saul because if he went, he's thinking, if I go and anoint David, Saul's going to have me killed.
Well, so Samuel was being asked to kind of commit treason there, but specifically...
He was mourning.
Yes. Yeah, whenever God calls Samuel and says, hey, go anoint David, he says, how long will you keep on mourning over Saul? Arise and go to the house of Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have chosen a son from amongst his family to be the next king. And so Samuel's life, it's kind of sad. He was faithful to God the whole way, but despite all that he did, the people kind of rejected him. And he spends the last few years of his life kind of, him and Saul never talked again. Remember after the thing in chapter 15, whenever he tore Saul's robe? They never saw each other again after that. They got close because there was one time whenever David was on the run, he went off to Samuel's place and Saul followed after him, but they never actually interacted. And so it's kind of sad. Samuel's been here through all of this. He led revival. He's the one who appointed the first king, but him and the first king were no longer on speaking terms. And then the second king he appointed is currently a fugitive. And this is how Samuel dies. He dies in this place where kind of the nation of Israel is once again in a state of spiritual decay and physical decay. Which is kind of a bummer. So Samuel died, and all Israel assembled and mourned for him, and they buried him in his house at Ramah. In a way that's kind of comforting, though. They rejected him in his life, but they did miss him in his death, right? And they actually collectively mourned for him, and they recognized that this was the end of an era, right? He was the Queen Elizabeth for them, right? He'd been serving them his entire life, and he had led all these different changes, and whenever he died, finally, they began to appreciate what he did. Probably because their current leader is not doing a very good job. And he's basically, the current leader is doing exactly what they want. Exactly what he warned them that the king would do. And so kind of sad. And what do you think the implications of this are? For David, maybe.
He doesn't have someone to go to for refuge anymore, because he always goes to Samuel first whenever he's fleeing from Saul.
Yeah. So for David, this is kind of a terrifying moment. We might have reason to see why David is not acting in maybe the most godly manner at this point, because he's kind of probably freaking out a little bit. Because Samuel was the spiritual leader. He was the go-to guy, right? Whenever David flees from Saul, the first place he goes is to Samuel. And now Samuel's gone. Samuel's the person who told him he would be king. And so Samuel still being around was kind of like proof, oh yes, like I will be king one day. Samuel's gone. He can't go to Samuel anymore. Uh-oh. So this there's a lot of things are shifting right here. This is also really good for Saul, right? Because from Saul's perspective, I mean, Samuel was kind of the one thing that was holding him in, right? Because he didn't want to outright oppose the prophet. Because the prophet had also made him king. And so now Saul's going to have a little bit more free reign. And so there's a lot of just implications of that one verse right there, right? And so it's kind of weird how we have this one chapter, Samuel dies, and it's immediately followed by this whole other story. And really that one verse on itself just stands by its own. Okay, now I'm going to read, and I'm going to read the whole slide. Okay? Then David rose and went down to the wilderness of Paran. And there was a man in Maon whose business was in Carmel. The man was very rich. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. He was shearing his sheep in Carmel. Now the name of the man was Nabal, and the name of his wife, Abigail. The woman was discerning and beautiful, but the man was harsh and badly behaved. He was a Calebite. David heard in the wilderness that Nabal was shearing his sheep. So David sent 10 young men. And David said to the young men, "Go up to Carmel, and go to Nabal, and greet him in my name. And thus you shall greet him. Peace be to you, and peace be to your house, and peace be to all that you have. I hear that you have shearers. Now, your shepherds have been with us, and we did them no harm, and they missed nothing all the time they were in Carmel. Ask your young men, and they will tell you. Therefore, let my young men find favor in your eyes, for we come on a feast day. Please give whatever you have at hand to your servants and to your son David." When David's young men came, they said all this to Nabal in the name of David, and then they waited. And Nabal answered David's servants, "Who is David? Who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants these days who are breaking away from their masters. Shall I take my bread and my water and my meat that I have killed for my shearers and give it to men who come from I do not know where?" So David's young men turned away and came back and told him all this. And David said to them, "Every man strap on his sword." And every man of them strapped on his sword. David also strapped on his sword. And about 400 men went up after David, while 200 remained with the baggage. Kind of an interesting story. And this is actually a much longer story. I mean, the whole chapter is actually like 44 verses long, so that's what I'm saying. It's really, we're not going to be able to go nearly as in depth as I would like to today. But what's happening here?
So basically, they know that Nabal has a lot of resources, and they're asking him for resources.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what we have is this is the whole Robin Hood thing, right? David and his merry men have been going around helping people, and apparently what they've been doing is because Saul is really slacking in his kingly duties, the Philistines and all of them have been really just kind of going around pillaging places. We read about this like a few chapters, before David even showed up, we saw where, the Philistines were going and invading places. Apparently they've been doing that type of stuff again. And so what David's men did is they did a really noble thing. They actually, David orchestrated all of them and sent men to go protect Nabal's flocks so that Nabal and them didn't have to worry about invading forces trying to steal their stuff. And so David and them have done a really, really good and gracious thing. And so David's going to send people to Nabal, and he's going to ask something that in that culture was a very appropriate thing to ask. Hey, just be like, "Hey, we've done this thing for you, which you could not have done for yourself. Would it be possible for us to get a little bit of payment?" Because once again, David and them are not living under the best circumstances right now. And so he says, "Hey, could you give us a little bit of payment?" And it's not really necessarily selfish to be asking this. Nowadays, I think we read this and we would think "Oh man, David's like he didn't ask you to do that stuff." I was like, well, yeah, but it was kind of understood. They if nobody was protecting them, they would have been having to deal with the Philistines. And so David and them stepped in, they helped out, and then they're saying, "Hey, could you help us out?" And Nabal just kind of brushed it aside. He's like, "No, I'm not helping you. Who's David? I don't know. Like, he's totally just pushing it under the, pushing it under the rug. Like, what? No, you haven't helped me out. What are you talking about? I'm not giving you anything. I don't owe you nothing. And David is not going to like that response because David's like, I was asking nicely. Okay, you want to do this the hard way? Fine. And so David's response is not going to be the best response, but there's still a lot we're going to be able to talk about there.
And it's for something they need.
Yes.
Like food.
Yeah, like, so what David's asking for is a very reasonable thing to be asking for, given what they've been doing and given what they need. David's response to what Nabal does, though, is not going to be the most appropriate. Because he is going to respond how a man of God necessarily probably shouldn't respond. And it's especially surprising if you contrast this story by the one in the previous chapter. Because there's some language from the previous chapter that's going to crop back up in this chapter, and you're going to be like, that's not accidental. Like, the author is definitely trying to contrast these two things, which I think is very important. Okay, so David rose and went down to the wilderness of Paran. So where was he at in the last chapter?
The wilderness in Gedi.
In Gedi, right? In Gedi, that was, do you remember, Sea of Galilee's here, Jordan River's down here, Dead Sea is over here, right? En Gedi is just right off the Dead Sea. It's like a little oasis in the middle of a desert region. If you go a little bit westward and a little bit south, I believe it is, you'll get to the wilderness of Paran, right? So this is still in more desert-like region, just in the southern region of Israel. Whenever it talks about Carmel here, this is a different Carmel than we hear mentioned in other places in the Bible, like the story of Elijah with the prophets of Baal. That's another Carmel, and that's up in northern Israel, near the Galilee region. So two different Carmels. This one's a little bit lower down. So he goes down the wilderness of Paran, and there was a man in Maon whose business was in Carmel. The man was very rich. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. He was shearing his sheep in Carmel. All right, so what do we learn about this guy right off the bat?
He's well off.
He's well off, which, from an Israelite standard, according to the law, means that you have a lot to give, right? Because wealth is not supposed to be something just for yourself. It's also to take care of the people around you, especially those who help you out, right? I mean, according to the law, remember whenever it talks about the grain fields and all the different vineyards and stuff, whenever you reap in your harvest, you're always supposed to just go through it one time and leave some left over for the poor people who come by, right? So even for just poor people who are wandering through your fields, they are allowed to actually pick some of your stuff because that's just what the Israelite law demanded. This guy is rich, so basically take that law and expand it 1,000,000-fold. This guy has a whole lot that he could be giving.
Is he an Israelite?
Well, yeah, he lives over, he is living in the Israelite region, right? And so just think about that, and whenever it's emphasizing this stuff, I think the reason why it emphasizes this in verse 2 is to point out that this guy has no good reason to deny David, right? That's the main thing it's trying to get across here. Whenever the guy's saying, oh, no, who's David? It's not because he's like, hey, I don't actually have any stuff to give you. No, the whole point is saying he has plenty to give. This dude is rich. He's got plenty of stuff. If he's turning down a favor for people, it's purely because he is selfish and he's greedy, right? So that's the main reason it's emphasizing that. Now, the name of the man was Nabal, and the name of his wife, Abigail. Do you know what the word Nabal means? It means foolish.
Oh.
So I think that it's possible that maybe Nabal was not his actual historical name, and just because, that would be kind of mean of the parents, Oh, this is my child. I will name him Foolish. So I don't know. I don't know if his name was actually Nabal, or if that is just what the author chose to call him to conceal his identity, or just for us to know, oh, okay, I see what's being said here. It is possible, I guess his name was Nabal, in which case I feel really bad for that guy because he lived up to his name, that's for sure. And the name Abigail what does Abigail mean?
Joy of the Father.
Joy of the Father, right? Ab, Father, Igail, right? So joy of the Father. There you go. So we've got foolish and my Father's joy. And the fool part is really the thing that's going to be more significant here because everything Nabal does is foolish. Now the name of the man was Nabal, and the name of his wife, Abigail. The woman was discerning and beautiful. but the man was harsh and badly behaved. He was a Calebite. We'll talk about the Calebite thing in a second. So what do we know about these two people? They are opposites, right? Which one is the positive person in the relationship? The woman, Abigail, right? She is, honestly, this whole chapter, Abigail she is really the hero of the chapter. She is amazing in this story. Nabal is the villain, and David is kind of the anti-hero, I would say, of this story. But Abigail comes out looking really good in this one. So what do we know about Abigail?
She's discerning and beautiful.
She is discerning and beautiful. So she's very wise, right? Talking about the proverb we just covered, right? So she's very wise, but she's also apparently very good looking. And I believe there are only two other people in the entire Bible who are given that description, the beautiful term, like I think the specific Hebrew word there. The two people are Rachel in the book of Genesis and Esther in the book of Esther, right? I believe those are the only two people. I could be wrong there, but very interesting, right? So very high praise, right? This woman is very wise and very beautiful. She is the whole package, right? This is just dream girl, right? The man was harsh and badly behaved. I think this is supposed to be some humor in the Bible, right? I mean, I don't think that you're supposed to read that and not laugh. Because it's like, oh wow, this is the most amazing woman ever. And then you got this total trash bag over here who's just, he's harsh, not a good guy, badly behaved. You kind of picture him as just a slob right off the bat. He's rich, he's got a lot of stuff, and hence why he probably was able to have such an amazing wife, because he had a lot of money, and money speaks, and especially in that culture, hey, here's a lofty bride price so I can have the finest maiden in the world, right? So you can probably see how this marriage how it came about. Probably not the happiest marriage, right? You got this discerning, beautiful wife stuck with foolish man, right?
I discern that my husband is dumb.
Yes, I discern that my husband is. That was actually just their pet names for one another, right? Yeah, she's the one who called him Nabal, and he just didn't know what Nabal meant, and he was like, "Oh, that's so cute." And she's like, "Little do you know." No. But yeah, so she's discerning, and beautiful. The man was harsh and badly behaved. I guess opposites attract. I don't know. And then it says he was a Calebite.
I can't remember.
Yeah, what is a Calebite?
Could be
That's not one of the tribes, is it?
It's not one of the tribes.
a descendant of Caleb.
Yes, and what do we know about Caleb?
Wait, was he in Judges?
He's mentioned in Judges, but he's more prominent in Joshua and even in the Torah.
Okay.
Who was Caleb?
He was
He came
one
with
of
Joshua into the promised land.
He came with Joshua into the Promised Land, right? You have the whole story where literally, there were 12 spies who were sent to to check out the Promised Land, and 10 of them came back saying, we can't go in there, and only 2 of them said, God's got this. Joshua and Caleb. Joshua is the one who leads them in, and Caleb's basically Joshua's right-hand man. Caleb's a really cool guy. And we have stories of them in Joshua and in Judges where Caleb is mentioned. And if you remember, he's actually, I think, the father-in-law of one of the first judges, right? Othniel. And so Caleb is a really cool, righteous guy. And Nabal is a Calebite. Why do you think that's being mentioned?
Just showing how opposite they were. Like, Caleb was wise, but Nabal was not.
Yeah. So Abigail is the joy of her father. Nabal, probably not the joy of his father's. Because Caleb's family is a righteous family. And Nabal is a harsh and badly behaved man. So probably not the favorite person in the family. But he is very rich. And sure enough, this region that they're living in is near Hebron. And Hebron is the land that was allotted to Caleb. Right? So he's still living in the region that Caleb received whenever we read Joshua and Judges and everything. But he definitely was a black sheep of the family when it came to reputation. They were righteous, the family of righteous Caleb, and he is a badly behaved man. So I think that's why that's mentioned there, just to be like, hey, yeah, he came from a good family, but he was the sour grape of the that's not a phrase that people use. Yeah, sour grape of the bunch, sour apple of the bunch. I don't know what the phrase is, but he was the sour one of the bunch of fruit that whatever the family of Caleb liked. So David heard in the wilderness that Nabal was shearing his sheep, right? So apparently while they're in the wilderness, he hears that the time for sheep shearing has come, and that would be the time whenever they're, it's the appropriate time. They're no longer doing a lot of the stuff with the sheep that they would need protection. Now they've brought the sheep in, they're shearing them, and this is an appropriate time for David to be like, hey, can I get paid for this? And obviously it hasn't described David's protecting them so far, but he's going to explain this over the course of the chapter. So he hears that they're shearing the sheep. So David sent 10 young men. And David said to the young men, go up to Carmel and go to Nabal and greet him in my name. And thus you shall greet him. Peace be to you, and peace be to your house, and peace be to all that you have.
Shalom.
Shalom, 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 shalom. What do you think the message David is trying to get across is? The word I just repeated again.
Yep. Shalom.
Shalom, peace. Right? Why would he send 10 people to say this message?
He comes in like he's not coming to bring like violence. But
Yeah.
he's-
He is coming in peace, right? He's not... Yeah, this isn't like a gangster sending his buddies in there to demand payment. He's coming in peace, and he's just asking an appropriate request, right? He's saying, hey, we've helped you out. Do you think that we could get paid for the service that we've done? Right? So he's not trying to go in there and be like, hey, pay up. It's not like that. No, he says, he doesn't send the whole army in there. He takes 10 men, right? Because we know that at this point he's got hundreds of people with him. He sends 10 men in there and says, hey, greet him in my name. Just say, hey, David sent us to you. And he says, peace to you, peace be upon your family, peace be upon your sheep, peace be upon your goats, peace be upon your house, peace be upon everything. We want to have a good, healthy relationship here, right? So that he's coming in the appropriate manner. I hear that you have shearers. Now, your shepherds have been with us, and we did them no harm, and they have missed nothing all the time they were in Carmel. Ask your young men, and they will tell you. Therefore, let my young men find favor in your eyes, for we come on a feast day. Please give whatever you have at hand to your servants and to your son David. So what does he ask?
Do we have some food?
Yeah, he
We're
says,
hungry.
hey, so if you hadn't heard, we've actually been spending the last few weeks, months, however long, protecting your shepherds while they were out taking care of the sheep and everything. And if you don't believe me, just ask them. They can testify to this. And we waited until the appropriate time, and now that y'all are shearing the sheep, and now that it's a feast day, the time whenever they would get everybody together and party to celebrate a successful year of taking care of their sheep, he says, I was just wondering, could you give us some of y'all's food? Right? I mean, you're having a feast, you're a wealthy man, we've been protecting you, and we could kind of use that. And so he says, please give whatever you have at your hands to your servants and to your son David. You see the humility, like where he's posturing himself underneath Nabal. He's not coming in here with guns blazing. Technically, he probably could. And he'd be like, hey, we've been helping you out. Pay up. But he doesn't do that. He humbly says, he asks for something that's totally reasonable. Hey man, we've been helping you out. You would not be able to even have this feast if we had not been protecting you. Could we just have a little bit of the food? We know you have enough. Could you just please give us enough to feed my troops, feed all those people, just for offering you this service? When David's young men came, they said all this to Nabal in the name of David. And then they waited, right? So they do it exactly as David asked. And Nabal answered David's servants, who is David? Who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants these days who are breaking away from their masters. Shall I take my bread and my water and my meat that I have killed for my shearers and give it to men who come from I do not know where? Is there any emphasis that you noticed with Nabal's words there? Mine. Why should I give my stuff to you? It's mine. He sounds like a little kid. So how does he respond?
Not well.
Probably not.
Very prideful.
Uh-huh. Very foolishly. Yes.
Harshly and badly behaved.
Harshly and badly behaved, yes. He is living up to his name, and he's living up to his reputation. Right? He is responding foolishly, and he's acting exactly how we were introduced to him. Right? He's harsh, and he's badly behaved.
Mm-hmm.
Who is David? What, you're really going to tell me you don't know who David is? David, like the giant slayer, the guy who was literally the #1 celebrity and #1 fugitive? You're going to act like you don't know who he is?
And his next question reveals like he really actually knows.
Yeah, who is the son of Jesse? It's like, I thought you didn't know who he was. No, he's like, I don't know who you're talking about. he's trying to play it down. Like, I don't remember you helping us out. Like, I didn't have that documented. Look, I got my list here. I didn't employ y'all. It's like, dude, like, you literally wouldn't be having this feast if we hadn't been helping you out. But he's trying to play it down because it's his stuff, and he isn't charitable, right? He isn't showing them the proper hospitality. He isn't showing them the proper charity. He's not doing anything that you're supposed to do when you're responding in a godly manner. He's responding foolishly, especially because if you know anything about David, you know you probably don't want to turn him down on something because, sure, David is a cool guy, but do you know what David's capable of? When he was a teenager, he killed a giant who stood 9 feet tall.
And before that,
lions and bears with his bare hands. And apparently the king thought he was such a threat that he was letting the whole kingdom fall apart just to try to kill David. Whenever the king asked for 100 Philistine foreskins to marry his daughter, David brought back 200 Philistine foreskins. Like, if you know anything about David, maybe just be careful in how you respond, because this dude is capable of ruining your life if he wanted to. Fortunately, David's a pretty cool dude. And so, typically we wouldn't expect David to react in a rash way. David is apparently not in a very good mood on this particular day, but it would be the wise thing to, just give David what he wants. Because David is capable of doing a lot of pretty intense stuff, right? David is a scrapper, and he knows how to survive. And maybe just don't respond this way whenever he has nicely sent you 10 young men to cordially ask for this when he really had an entire army he could have sent in there and demanding it, right? And so the guy does not respond at all in the proper way. Shall I take my bread and my water and my meat that I have killed for my shearers and give it to men who come from I do not know where? I don't even know who you're talking about. I don't remember anybody helping me out. Why does he not know about it? Probably because he wasn't actually doing any of the work. He wasn't doing the killing. He probably had all of his other shepherds doing that stuff. He's like, I didn't see y'all. Yeah, that's because you were too busy being in there feasting, right? So David's young men turned away and came back to him and told him all this. Kind of brings back the 1 Samuel 17 moment, whenever David's walking amongst his brothers and stuff in the army, and he hears Goliath taunting the people of Israel, and you're like, uh-oh, dangerous things can happen whenever David hears news he doesn't like. Whenever he heard about Goliath, he was like, oh, it's on. Well, apparently same thing's going to happen here with Nabal. And David said to his men, every man strap on his sword. And every man of them strapped on his sword. David also strapped on his sword. So, how does David respond?
Like eye for eye?
Maybe a little bit beyond eye for eye. David's saying, all right, guys, it's getting serious. We're going to go kill these guys. Maybe a bit of an overreaction. At the time, you can totally understand where he's coming from. He's like, hey, we have protected you and saved your life, and you're denying us just the basic decency. We're going to kill you. From a fleshly and human perspective, you might get where David's coming from. He has suffered enough. He has helped these people out of the kindness of his heart because he's doing what a king should do, and he's taking care of the people, and they're not giving him even the bare necessities of kindness. So you can see where David's coming from. But that's not how a man after God's own heart should respond, right? And so he says, all right, guys, grab your guns. We're going to go take these guys out.
Yeah.
We asked nice. Okay, we were just being polite. But if you're not going to show us politeness back, all right, we're going to come in here and we're going to destroy you. And so this is the dangerous side of David, right? David is a guy who knows how to survive. And he has been kind, he has been gracious, and now he's like, okay, now this is not cool. And so he's reacting a little bit harshly here.
Yeah, at first I was going to say, well, no, it never says there that he's going to kill them. But then I realized, a sword in those days is like a gun in these days.
Yes.
That it is made for killing.
Yeah, and he's going to specify it in a few verses.
Or defending against killing.
Yeah.
And he could have gone he could have not said pick up your sword and gone and said just gone with a bunch of people and probably have more people and grab this stuff. But clearly because he said pick up your sword, he had more
Yes.
than that.
No, David, his response could be like, okay, well, let's just go with more people, and maybe I'll go personally and ask. You know, he could have done that, or he could have just said, you know what, that's fine. We're just going to go somewhere else, and good luck taking care of your sheep in the future. He could have done a bunch of other things, but instead he's like, all right, guys, grab your weapons. It's time to go wreck some fools. And he's going to specify what he's wanting to do in just a second. And about 400 men went up after David, while 200 men remained with the baggage. So we got 600 people traveling with David at this point. He says, 200 of y'all stay here. 400 other people, grab your swords. This is not just a small skirmish. He is marching an army into battle because this guy turned this stuff down. Once again, not the David that we recognize, right? I mean, literally in the previous chapter, the person who had been trying to kill him, like, David spares. And now this guy, David's wanting to murder? It's like, whoa, like, what happened here? And people speculate, like, was David just in a bad mood on this day? We don't know. I think that maybe one thing that we see here, and I think there's probably room for application with this, is that the reason why he spared Saul wasn't as much for Saul's sake as it was for God's sake, right? This is the Lord's anointed. From his perspective, Saul was a holy figure, and he would not do anything to touch the Lord's anointed. Nabal is just another guy. So from David's perspective, Saul, even though Saul had done all this stuff to him, Saul is still elevated far above David in David's humble perspective. For this guy, they're on equal levels. Oh, you did something wrong? Like, he doesn't have the religious motivation to spare Nabal, right? And so you can kind of see how that might change things, right? You can see a lot about how people... You learn a lot about somebody's character based on how they treat their equals, right? Most people will respect the people who they view as above them. But how do you treat those who you consider equal to yourself? That's probably where we can find some application here. Because David, even though, like, he still views Saul as a father figure, as a mentor, Saul has done all this stuff against him, but he's still the Lord's anointed, he's the king. Nabal, he's a fool. And he's acted foolishly.
Or how you treat people who are equal to you, but you think they might be below you. Like the way some people talk to, like, waiters, who are like serve.
Absolutely.
Like, really, we're all equal, but some people will, like, talk terribly to them.
Yeah.
As if they're below them.
Yeah, and so I think we can learn a lot from that. And I think that's probably the key to why David responds differently. On one side, he has righteous and holy motivations because he's honoring God. On this one, this is just a guy who wronged him, and he's like, that's messed up. And he has a personal connection to Saul. He doesn't have a personal connection to Nabal. Their personal connection was that he'd been helping Nabal out, and now Nabal did not show appreciation. And so I think we can see where David's coming from a fleshly perspective, but it's not who David is. So we move on. But one of the young men told Abigail, Nabal's wife, "Behold, David sent messengers out of the wilderness to greet our master, and he railed at them. Yet the men were very good to us, and we suffered no harm, and we did not miss anything when we were in the fields, as long as we went with them. They were a wall to us both by night and by day, and all the while we were with them keeping the sheep. Now therefore know this, and consider what you should do. For harm is determined against our master and against all his house, and he is such a worthless man that one cannot speak to him."
Oh, as we were speaking of earlier, the foolish will not listen to anybody.
The foolish will not listen to anybody. Yes, that's actually a big thing about Nabal here. He's not willing to listen to advice, and that's another thing about David. We'll have to see how David responds whenever advice is given to him. That's crucial, I think, to being a man after God's own heart. Okay, so let's just start with that. What happens here?
One of the shepherds is like, they did help us. You should tell Nabal.
Yeah, I think that it's probably safe to say that these shepherds are picking up on the fact, like, yeah, that was a dumb way to respond to David. I mean, think about who David is. Think about all David's done. You probably don't want to get on David's bad side because everybody who gets on David's bad side ends up being dead. Typically, it's because David's acting righteously, but the thing is we haven't seen David act unrighteously before, and typically people who are acting unrighteously are capable of even more ruthless things. So if David, when acting righteously, is capable of destroying everybody in his path, I don't think you want to see David acting sinfully. And so these shepherds are like, okay, so Nabal is a fool. Let's go talk to the woman of the house, because maybe she can kind of rectify the situation. And so they go to Abigail, and they say, hey, here's the situation. David sent messengers here. Nabal acted like a total idiot. And we're just going to tell you, David is correct. Like, David and his men were helping us out. Night and day, they were protecting us. Nobody got through. And our sheep were totally safe with them watching. If anything, David understated how much they'd done. And so they go to Abigail and they say, you've got to do something about this. Like, whatever Nabal did, it's not going to end well. You need to fix the situation. They probably don't know that David and them are marching in right now, but they probably can tell that something like that's going to happen. Okay, just for the sake of time, we're going to jump to verse 18. Then Abigail made haste and took 200 loaves and 2 skins of wine and 5 sheep already prepared and 5 seahs of parched grain and 100 clusters of raisins and 200 cakes of figs and laid them on donkeys. And she said to her young men, go on before me. Behold, I come after you. But she did not tell her husband Nabal. And as she rode on the donkey and came down under cover of the mountain, behold, David and his men came down toward her, and she met them. Now David had said, surely in vain have I guarded all that this fellow has in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that belonged to him. And he has returned me evil for good. God do so to the enemies of David, and more also, if by morning I leave so much as one male of all who belong to him. David is not very happy right now. Maybe he's just been really hungry. Maybe he woke up on the wrong side of the bed. Or maybe he's just reacting how a person in that culture would react, right? He asked for the basic human decency, and this guy denied it to him despite this guy owing him everything, right? David showed hesed to Nabal, and Nabal didn't even respond appropriately. Ooh, this is not good at all. And so, what does Abigail do?
Vetoes what her husband said and gives them stuff anyways.
Yeah, that's interesting, especially whenever you consider the biblical standard for morality, right? This is actually something that Mike talks a whole lot about. Like Mike Stratton, if y'all don't know him, he's one of my, colleagues. Ooh, I get to use that term. That's fun. He's one of the other teachers at the school that I work at, but he leads a connection group. And lately he's been really emphasizing the fact that a lot of the times obeying God does not always look the same as good morals, right? Like just based on how we typically define morality, right? I mean, Mary giving birth to Jesus while being a betrothed virgin, that doesn't look too good, right? The Israelites being sent in to destroy the Canaanites doesn't necessarily look great. The Bible's talking about wives submitting to husbands, yet right here it's praising Abigail for not submitting to her husband. So there's a lot of things that break the normal, like there is a certain normal structure of morality, but there's a lot of times where God calls people to do something that really looks immoral, but if they're honoring God, it actually is the right thing to do. And that's just very interesting. There's a lot of instances of that in the Bible, where people are doing something that really seems morally questionable, but it's actually the right thing to do because they're focusing on God. Right? That's just very interesting there.
I think that's probably why it mentions that she's discerning before this, because she's clearly discerned that
yes,
this is the better option.
Exactly. Like this isn't a woman who's just acting rebelliously. She's discerning what the righteous thing to do is here, and what she's doing is actually a clear. It's a good example of, you submit to authority unless that authority causes you to rebel against God. And through Abigail's conversation with David, that's going to be coming up in a few verses, we see that she recognizes that David is on God's side. And so Nabal might be rebelling against David, but Abigail sees this as Nabal rebelling against God, because God is on David's side. And so she is going to reject her husband's authority for the sake of appeasing God and pleasing God and serving God's servant. And so there is a really important reason for why she's doing this, but from an outsider's perspective, this does not look good, right? And that's just the case. I mean, whenever Jesus showed up, people were constantly critiquing him because he was doing the thing that didn't look exactly kosher for their day, right? Here he's traveling around and he doesn't just have men disciples, he has women disciples. Oh, that's kind of moral, like, it looks weird. Nothing weird was happening, but it does look strange, right? Jesus is going around, and while John the Baptist was fasting and, he never touched any strong drink, Jesus partied. And he would hang out, and he would drink wine, and he would dance, and he would do this stuff. And people looked at him, and they're like, oh, this doesn't sit right with our normal morals. And so that's just a very interesting thing throughout the Bible, where sometimes morality is actually not going to look very moral. Like, God counts the wisdom of man as foolish, right? And so here Abigail makes haste, and she just doesn't tell her husband what she's doing. And notice what she grabs. 200 loaves, 2 skins of wine, 5 sheep already prepared, 5 seahs of parched grain, and 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 cakes of figs. Is she just giving him a little bit of stuff?
A lot.
She's giving him a whole lot of stuff. She is, and she doesn't tell her husband about this because they're pretty well off. They've got more than enough things. This is not like, it's not like she's giving away like 90% of their estate. She's giving David more than he ever asked for, but really it's not going to hurt them at all. And so it's not like she's like, oh, honey, I gave away all of our money. That's not what's happening. She's giving David more than he asked for, and that's it. She is going above and beyond. She's showing hesed. Right? She's righting this wrong. She said to her young men, go on before me. Behold, I come after you. So she's sending them with all the gifts, and she's going to come behind them. But she did not tell her husband Nabal. I just like that detail. Why would she not tell her husband Nabal?
Because he wouldn't want her to do that.
Yes, and what do we know about Abigail?
She's discerning.
She's discerning. If she goes to Nabal, what's he going to say? Don't do that, right? And then she would just be outright working against him. Instead, right now, she'd be like, oh, honey, I didn't know. I was just doing the right thing. These people helped us out. And so she doesn't tell Nabal because that's just going to cause more conflict. And if anything, then Nabal's going to follow after them and then really stir up some stuff with David. She's saying, you know what, honey? You stay home. I got to go run an errand real quick. No, it has nothing to do with David. I'll be back. Right? She's like, we don't need to tell Nabal about this. And as she rode on the donkey and came down under cover of the mountain, like I love that, just those little details there, because it's like zooming in on the story, right? It's making you like feel the tension of the moment, right? You can picture her riding on the donkey, coming down under the cover of the mountain, right? The shadows passing over her. And behold, David and his men came down toward her. So here they are going in the direction. And what are David and his men doing?
They're ready to fight.
Yeah, they're probably doing like their war chants and stuff, getting pumped up, ready to go fight. David's probably got his like harp in the front. He's like just playing some like heavy metal psalms. He's probably playing all those psalms where he's like, God, punch in the face of our enemies and destroy them. Like he's probably playing that stuff. Here they are coming to meet each other. And David had said, surely in vain have I guarded all that this fellow has in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed out of all that belonged to him, and he has returned me evil for good. What's interesting about that phrase?
The Bible says don't do it.
Don't do it. Yeah. So, like, don't do what Nabal did.
Don't
But
return
is there a phrase in there that stands out to you?
For me, it's surely in vain.
Surely in vain? Okay.
Evil for good.
Evil for good. Why would that one stick out to you, possibly? Do you remember the last chapter we went through? Where Saul...
Oh yeah, he was like.
Oh.
Yeah. Remember
Yeah.
when Saul and David were interacting? And Saul says, I have repaid you evil for good, but you have repaid me good for evil. Right? And so here we have the same exact scenario happening. Right? Nabal, like Saul, has repaid David evil for good. But with Saul, David was willing to forgive him. With Nabal, he's marching men in there to go kill the guy. And you're looking at this and you're like, David, what happened? Literally in the previous chapter, you were forgiving the guy who's literally been hunting you down. Now you're wanting to kill this guy who really means nothing to you? And it's just very odd. It's supposed to throw us off. And I think that this is on purpose, because the thing is, even prior to this moment, we got to realize this stuff doesn't come out of nowhere. David probably struggled with anger and all this type of stuff throughout the whole story, But the author chose to include this moment specifically to contrast it with chapter 24, right? He's being selective on the stories of David, right? It's not like we know every day in the life of David. We just see selected moments that the author put there, inspired by God, to highlight something. And so I think we're going to have to figure out, what does this say about being a man after God's own heart? Apparently that doesn't require perfection, which is encouraging. But we're going to have to see about that, right? So he says, surely in vain have I guarded all that this fellow is in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that belonged to him, and he's returned me evil for good. He says, I don't even know why we did this. I mean, what was the point in helping this guy out if we don't get anything from it? Which, once again, doesn't sound a lot like David, does it? It doesn't sound very godly to say that, right? Oh, why would I help you if I don't get anything from this? It's like, David, what are you talking about, man? Like, that's not who you are. Like, this isn't you, man. And Abigail is going to perceive that, which is cool, because this is going to be the first time David and Abigail interact, but Abigail's going to know, this isn't who you are. But then look at what David says. Oh, yikes. God do so to the enemies of David, and more also, if by morning I leave so much as one male of all who belong to him. That first phrase there, God do so to the enemies of David, he's making he's like swearing by God, basically. This is strong language. And he says, oh, God, help me if by the morning I haven't killed every single person in this household. Like, David is just like, I'm surprised he's not turning into a big green rage monster right now. Because this dude is fuming. He's mad. And from a fleshly perspective, you get it. You're like, yeah, this dude wronged David. But we've come to expect better of David. Right? That's why it's so surprising. If this was Saul, we'd be like, well, yeah, of course. I mean, this is just how you react. If this was one of us, we'd probably be like, yeah, totally. And honestly, we'd probably pat somebody on the back and say, you know what? You deserve to be mad. You've gone through enough already. You know, this guy deserves to pay. That's how we probably treat people. But from David, we've expected better. And so, we move on. I'm just going to read this first paragraph. When Abigail saw David, she hurried and got down from the donkey and fell before David on her face and bowed to the ground. She fell at his feet and said, on me alone, my Lord, be the guilt. Please let your servant speak in your ears and hear the words of your servant. Let not my Lord regard this worthless fellow Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. But I, your servant, did not see the young men of my Lord whom you sent. Now then, my Lord, as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, because the Lord has restrained you from blood guilt, and from saving with your own hand, now then let your enemies, and those who seek to do evil to my Lord, be as Nabal. And now let this present that your servant has brought to my Lord be given to the young men who follow my Lord. Please forgive the trespass of your servant, for the Lord will certainly make my Lord a sure house, because my Lord is fighting the battles of the Lord, and evil shall not be found in you so long as you live. If men rise up to pursue you and to seek your life, the life of my Lord shall be bound in the bundle of the living in the care of the Lord your God. And the lives of your enemies he shall sling out as from the hollow of a sling. And when the Lord has done to my Lord according to all the good that he has spoken concerning you, and has appointed you prince over Israel, my Lord shall have no cause of grief or pangs of conscience for having shed blood without cause, or for my Lord working salvation himself. And when the Lord has dealt well with my Lord, then remember your servant. This is what I'm saying. When Abigail shows up, she is a superstar. What does she say here?
Please forgive Nabal. Basically,
I don't know if she's saying forgive Nabal.
the transgression.
Yes, so she's saying forgive the transgression, because technically she's not even putting the blame on Nabal, interestingly enough. She's actually kind of doing what Jesus did and taking Nabal's sin and putting it upon herself. What else is she saying here?
Calling him a fool.
Calling her husband a fool. Probably a good thing Nabal's not standing right beside her. What else?
She's telling David, you don't really want to do this.
Yes, she's saying, David, I know you, man, even though she's never met this guy. But she's heard of David's reputation, says, you don't want to do this. She says, one day you are going to sit on the throne. Which just tells you where the general public views David, right? Saul is king, but everybody knows David's going to be on the throne. And she says, you don't want this to stick with your conscience. This is not you. You are a righteous man after God's own heart. If you respond violently as you're wanting to do right now, you're going to live with that the rest of your life. And that's going to stain your reputation, even if it's just with yourself. Other people are going to understand why you did it. But this isn't who you are. Whenever you sit on that throne, you want to know that God put you there and that you weren't forcing your way there. Like she really she understands David really well. She really is discerning. She's meeting this guy for the first time, yet she already knows more about himself than he knows currently. Because she's looking at him, she's saying, hey, David, this isn't you. This is not who you are. You're not the type of guy who forces people to give you things. You're not the type of guy who forces your way. You're not the type of guy who makes sure that people give you what you deserve. You're not the type of guy who forces your way into authority. You're the type of guy who lets God do what he's going to do and is gracious to people. Don't let my husband's stupid decision cause you to change who you are. You're a man after God's own heart. Don't let Nabal change that. Like, Abigail is awesome here. Like, what she's saying, it's this long speech, but it's so good. So let's walk through it a little bit. So when she sees David, she hurries, gets down off the donkey, falls before David, on her face, bows to the ground, immediately humbles herself. She fell at his feet and says, on me alone, my Lord, be the guilt. I mean, like, as a Christian, you can't even read that without thinking of Jesus, right? She's saying, hey, put it on me. Like, whatever my husband did, just put it on me. I don't care. Like, and what was David wanting to do? Kill them. He was wanting to kill not only Nabal, but every member of the household who was a male. And she says, put the guilt on me. I'll take it. I, Abigail, will die in the place of everybody else. But let me plead my case first. Please let your servant speak in your ears and hear the words of your servant. Your servant, your servant. She's humbling herself. Let not my Lord regard this worthless fellow Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. And I don't think she's trying to insult her husband here necessarily. She's saying, hey, don't judge my husband because he's just being who he is. He's not a bright guy. He is I don't think she's trying to purposely insult him. I think she's just saying, this is who my husband is. This is what I have to deal with daily. Like, if I was constantly giving my husband what he deserved, he would be sleeping in the pig's pens every night. She says, he's not a wise guy. He's badly behaved. He's just responding in his sinful nature. To quote Jesus once again, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. Right? They're just doing what sinful people do. They're sinning. And she says, hey, Nabal, his name means fool, and he's foolish. He's just doing what a fool does. So don't blame him. If you're going to blame somebody, blame me. Because I am discerning. And I am able to, if you're going to hold judgment against somebody, hold it against me, but not my husband. He's just foolish. Let not my Lord regard this worthless fellow Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. Right? Wherever he goes, folly just is right by him. So you shouldn't be mad at him when he did this, because this is not the first blunder he's made. He's constantly doing foolish and dumb things. Don't ruin your reputation because this guy was just being... Don't ruin your reputation because this is your first time encountering my husband. Right? My husband's been doing stuff like this all along. Don't mess up yourself just because he was being himself. And think about the application there. Right? That's really significant for us as well. Application-wise, I mean, so often we respond to people in an ungodly manner when they were just being their sinful selves that they always are being. But we are willing to set aside our own godliness and our own Christian character in order to stoop down to their level, when really, who's winning there? Right? You might have your vengeance quenched for about 30 seconds, and then the rest of your life you're going to deal with the consequences of stooping down to their level. And so Abigail, what she's saying is brilliant. But I, your servant, did not see the young men of my Lord whom you sent. She's like, I wasn't there. Like, if I had been there, I can guarantee you I would have done my best to make sure he didn't respond that way. Basically, he's like a little toddler who always needs to have somebody nearby babysitting him. Because she's like, he just makes decisions like this. I wasn't there. I didn't know anything about this. And so if you're going to kill me, you're going to kill somebody who really does not deserve to be killed. Now then, my Lord, as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, because the Lord has restrained you from blood guilt and from saving with your own hand, now then let your enemies and those who seek to do evil be to my Lord, to do evil to my Lord be as Nabal. So what does she say there?
Basically, he's saying, or no, she's saying that if you do what you're planning to do, you're going to be like Nabal.
Yeah. Well, she's saying God is giving you an opportunity right now to not do what you're about to do. God is restraining you from blood guilt, right? Because right now you are responding in the flesh. You're responding out of your anger, and you're about to go do something you'd regret for the rest of your life. And by me being here right now, God is restraining you. He's trying to hold you back, and he's trying to keep you from saving with your own hand, right? He's trying to keep you from going and earning something for yourself, which we've talked about this with David. He is not the type of guy who fights for his own glory. He's the type of guy who says, you know what, I'm going to sit back and let God exalt me when God exalts me. And so she says, me being here right now is God giving you a choice. If you go forward with this, I don't know what's going to happen. But if you stop right now, I pray that all of your enemies will be to you as Nabal, as a foolish person who will bring about his own destruction. And now, let this present that your servant has brought to my Lord be given to the young men who follow my Lord. Right? Hey, I sent all this stuff ahead of me. Take it. There it is. It's more than you asked for, and I'm trying to rectify the situation. It's kind of like Paul in the book of Philemon, where he says, hey, whatever your slave stole from you, I'll pay it back. Take it. It's yours. I don't want it. Let this present follow your Lord. Okay. Please forgive the trespass of your servant. Who is your servant here? Her. Right? So even though she hasn't done anything wrong, she calls it her trespass. Because Nabal's definitely not his servant. No, Nabal is just a fool. But she said, let it be on me. Forgive the trespass of your servant. Forgive my trespass. But Abigail, you didn't do anything. That's the whole point. Right? She's literally doing what Jesus did. She's literally being like, hey, like the innocent person in place of the guilty, producing forgiveness for the many. Right? It's beautiful what she's doing. For the Lord will certainly make my Lord a sure house, because my Lord is fighting the battles of the Lord, and evil shall not be found in you so long as you live. You know what's cool about this? This is prophetic. Because you know what God has not promised David yet? This sure house that she's talking about. That's not coming until 2 Samuel chapter 7, where God is going to make a promise to David, where David's going to say, God, I want to build a temple for you. And God's going to say, you know what? I like what you're thinking, but I'm not going to have you build me a temple, but I will build a house for you. And he's going to promise David that that David's dynasty will last forever, and that eventually produces Jesus, right? Because Jesus is the eternal king. He's the eternal Davidic king. Right here, that promise hasn't been made yet. David knows he's going to be king, but she says, you're not just going to be king. God is going to give you a long-lasting, enduring house. Like, this woman knows more about David and his destiny than has even been revealed to David at this point. Because this woman is discerning the heart of God. She can see what God is doing through David, and she says, don't mess that up. Like, God chose you for a reason, because you're a man after God's own heart. Don't let my stupid husband ruin your entire reputation and cause you to change what God's doing through you. Don't let that happen. If men rise up to pursue you and to seek your life, the life of my Lord shall be bound in the bundle of the living in the care of the Lord your God. If people rise up to try to attack you, David, you're going to be wrapped up like God's just going to be holding you close like a little baby. Right? And the lives of your enemies he shall sling out as from the hollow of a sling. She's speaking David's language. Right? David, he rose to fame because of his skill with a sling. He knows how fast a sling can cast a rock. And she says, that's what your enemies are going to be like if you stay faithful to God. If you keep doing what you've always been doing, God is going to put your enemies like a stone in a sling, and he's going to sling them out. He's going to destroy them. But he's going to hold close. He's going to take care of you. And when the Lord has done to my Lord according to all the good that he has spoken concerning you, and has appointed you prince over Israel. This is just crazy. Like, these are treasonous words that she's saying right now. There's currently a king in Israel, and she is talking to David saying, God is going to make you the king in his place. But she is so confident about it. And she's saying, God has spoken these things concerning you. You know it too. And David's probably like, how do you know it though? Right? That's really the more surprising thing. Like she is like literally stating things towards David that he wasn't even aware of yet. And she's just saying it so confidently because she can discern, like she really is discerning. And think about David here, just to set up what's going to be coming in the future. You got this drop-dead gorgeous woman in front of you who is just the godliest person who's just like humbly calling you out on your sin and calling you back to God so that you could be the man that God created you to be. He's probably liking this a little bit. He's like, oh man, I like you. And when the Lord has done to my Lord according to all the good he's spoken concerning you, and has appointed you prince over Israel, my Lord shall have no cause of grief or pangs of conscience for having shed blood without cause, or for my Lord working salvation himself. If you spare me, and you spare my husband, and you spare our entire household, when God makes you king, your conscience won't be afflicted. You won't have to wrestle through the guilt of having shed innocent blood, and you won't have to wrestle through the guilt of trying to put yourself on the throne. Instead, you'll be of clear conscience. You will have saved yourself from that sin by just being obedient to God and by being gracious. Isn't that interesting? The whole point is that in order to be a man after God's own heart, you can't only be seeking out justice. You have to be seeking out graciousness. As Christ forgave you, so you must also forgive. That is what Paul says in Colossians. It is not so you should also forgive, so you must also forgive. If we are willing to receive things from God, we have to be willing to share those same things with others. And if David is willing to be exalted by God, he must be willing to show that same graciousness towards other people. And so even in this moment, David is sinning, yet God is still going to do great things through him. And so she's saying, you have a choice. Are you willing to let God exalt a sinner like you and not show that same grace towards somebody who sinned against you? Because that's not what a man after God's own heart does. A man after God's own heart will forgive the person who's wronged him, even if that person doesn't deserve the forgiveness. Like this is just, it's profound stuff, what she's saying here. And when the Lord has dealt with you, with my Lord, remember your servant. So what does she say there?
When God blesses you, please remember me.
Yeah, and whenever God has done all the things he's promised, don't forget about me. Right? Wink, wink. I don't think that's what she's meaning here. But David's not going to forget about her, even sooner than she probably imagined. All right, verse 32 to 35. And David said to Abigail, blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who sent you this day to meet me. Blessed be your discretion, and blessed be you, who have kept me this day from blood guilt and from working salvation with my own hand. For as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, who has restrained me from hurting you, unless you had hurried and come to meet me, truly by morning there had not been left to Nabal so much as one male. Then David received from her hand what she had brought to him, and he said to her, go up in peace to your house. See, I have obeyed your voice, and I have granted your petition. That's a man after God's own heart. How does he respond?
He listens to her insight and the wisdom that she gave and actually considers it instead of just like throwing it off to the side.
Yeah. To reference our proverb of the day, what did Proverbs 4:7 say? This goes to
To
Abigail.
get wisdom.
Yeah.
Acquire wisdom.
If you desire wisdom, this is the beginning of wisdom. Get wisdom. Right? David is doing exactly what you should do. Here he is running, and think about how humble he has to be here. Like this dude is fuming, he is angry, he's an emotional guy, and those are the hardest people to talk to. Yet in this moment, he hears what she's saying, and he realizes this is a godly person with godly counsel, and rather than obeying the desires of my flesh, I'm going to listen to her. Which is interesting, once again, just because we know how women were treated, especially back in those days. Their words were not esteemed as highly. Yet he's saying, here's this woman prostrated, bowed down before him, and he's got an entire army behind him. And he's going to have to admit publicly in front of everybody that I led y'all into folly, and I was about to cause y'all to sin against God. But he's willing to do that, because he's willing to be rebuked, and he's willing to repent, and he's willing to admit when he's wrong. That is what a man after God's own heart does. So we're learning about things, right? A man after God's own heart and a woman after God's own heart isn't a perfect person. but it's a person who's willing to receive correction and willing to change whenever they get corrected. That's really encouraging for all of us, right? Because if David didn't mess up, we would have a high standard. I mean, it's kind of like Jesus, right? We're never going to live up to Jesus' standard. He's perfect. But David, we should be able to live up to that standard. But we have to learn from him. And so we don't have to be perfect. Sometimes the flesh is going to get the best of us. But that's why we surround ourselves by fellow godly people who can look at us and say, hey, this isn't you. This isn't what God wants you to do. Slow your horse. Think about this. You don't want to do something that you're going to regret the rest of your life. Think about what God wants you to do. Slow down and do that thing. I know that you want to react this way because it seems like the right thing to do in here and because it would feel right. But is that what God wants you to do? Is that what Jesus did for you? Is that what God is doing for you? Okay, so maybe don't respond that way. And so this is it's teaching us about what a man after God's own heart does, right? He's willing to receive this correction. So he says, blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel. Notice he doesn't praise her. He praises God. Because he says, you didn't come here of your own accord. God literally sent you to here right now because God is so gracious that rather than allowing me to just walk into my sin, he sent somebody to stop me. He says, blessed be God who sent you this day to meet me. Blessed be your discretion, right? Which came from who? God, right? Blessed be your discretion and blessed be you who have kept me this day from blood guilt and from working salvation with my own hand. He says, you were spot on. The two things that I would have felt most guilty about is shedding innocent blood and working salvation with my own hand. Like David, that's not what he wants to do. He wants to respect life, and he wants God to bring about salvation. The battle belongs to the Lord, not to him. If he's going to end up on the throne, God's got to put him there. And so he says, you're right. This is not who I am. And I am so grateful that God put you here. I am so grateful that God gave you the discretion to make that first step. And I'm so grateful for you for obeying God. Like, this is a grateful man who is humbling himself and saying, you're right. That's my bad. For as surely as the Lord God of Israel lives, who has restrained me from hurting you, unless you had hurried and come to meet me. Like, if you had been a moment later, it would have been too late. We were about to get in there. We were about to start slaughtering. But you came in and you stepped right into the battle lines. Like, literally, there's 200 men behind me with swords ready. Or 400 men, right? 400 men behind him with swords ready. And she approached an army single-handedly and offered her life instead. And he says, you are amazing. If you hadn't done this, I would have lived my entire life regretting this moment. But you stopped me. Then David received from her hand what she had brought him, and she said to her, go up to peace to your house. See, I've obeyed your voice. I have granted your petition. He says, no hard feelings. You can leave. I apologize. I made a mistake. And he owns up to it and says, I'll give you your petition. I will remember you. I'll do all that stuff for you. You can leave. Go back to your house. We don't have to mention this again. All right. Now let's start wrapping this up. And Abigail came to Nabal, and behold, he was holding a feast in his house, like the feast of a king. And Nabal's heart was merry within him, for he was very drunk. So she told him nothing at all until the morning light. In the morning, when the wine had gone out of Nabal, his wife told him these things, and his heart died within him, and he became as stone. And about 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. What's that?
It's so dramatic.
Yeah, no, it's very dramatic. And it's ironic, right? You're kind of supposed to laugh at this. But what happens? Karma, okay.
He was so greedy that finding out that his wife gave away his stuff just...
Homeboy literally has a stroke. Like, he's rich, yet hearing that this happened literally makes the guy have a stroke. But notice, Nabal, like, what David had intended still happened, right? David had originally intended to kill Nabal. And David didn't need to kill the rest of the family, right? Nabal's the one who'd sinned. And so Nabal's the one who dies. But who's the one who brings about the death? God. Right? What David was going to do, God has done. God is the one who executed justice. God is the one who executed vengeance. God is the one who brought about salvation. Interesting, right? So it is exactly as planned. Okay, but let's talk about this first verse. And Abigail came to Nabal, and behold, right? Behold is every time that word shows up, it's like the author is inviting you to see from the perspective of the character, right? Abigail walks in, and she's probably like, homegirl just probably was ordering around servants and being like, okay, you load up this, you load up this. She's probably sweating, covered in dirt. She was just bowing down. She just literally talked down an army of angry men. She walks back in there. She is tired. And behold, he is holding a feast in his house like the feast of a king. Homeboy is totally oblivious to the fact that he literally just got spared from a total slaughter. Right? Like this dude, like when we're talking about foolish, this guy has no idea what's going on. He literally did one of the stupidest things that he was about to die, yet he's just partying it up. I think there is kind of a metaphor there for just people who are living in sin, right? Whenever we are living according to our sinful desires, we don't even know what we're doing. We're just out here having a great time, and we're just setting up our own disaster, right? This dude had no idea that an army had literally just been coming towards him, and even whenever his wife gets back, he's too drunk to even hear the story, right? He doesn't even figure it out until the next morning. He's got a massive hangover. His wife tells him this, and then he's mad, has a stroke, and then he eventually dies. Like, this guy never gets to appreciate what his wife did. She literally talked down an army to spare his life, and he was too busy partying and enjoying his own greed. Also, the feast was like that of a king. That means that he definitely had enough to give David. Right? He said, no, I'm not giving you anything. Instead, I'm going to take all that God has given me, and I'm going to use it to please myself. I'm going to have a massive feast. If only he had invited David and his men to that feast, all of this would have been avoided. Right? Hey, y'all should come. Thanks so much for helping me out. Y'all are invited to the feast. But he didn't do that. Instead, he said, no, this is my feast. It's for me. It's my stuff. And apparently, he had so much stuff that he didn't even notice that a lot of it was missing whenever Abigail went. So he was able to have the feast of a king despite the fact that all the stuff was gone. Right? So this guy had more than enough. And so the David situation has been taken care of. And so one villain has been calmed down, but now we've got to take care of the bigger bad. Right? Nabal. Abigail comes to Nabal. Behold, he was holding a feast in his house like the feast of a king. I guess he was having such a great time he didn't even notice his wife wasn't there. This dude is just totally oblivious. He really is a fool. He's just a dumb person. He's just he is a person who, like, literally the definition of a person living in greed, living in sin, living in luxury. But also, whenever we're talking about people having feasts like this, we have to realize that even the biggest feast in ancient Israel is nothing compared to like the average meal that we have nowadays. So just keep that in mind whenever we're looking at Nabal and we're like, oh, this dude's rich. Pretty much everybody in this room probably has more money than Nabal ever had. Maybe that's exaggeration a little bit, because he had 3,000 sheep. That's a lot. But we just have to realize that the fact that we're sitting right now in a room with air condition and electric lights, and we know where our next meal is coming from, and we know, like, we have access to like running water everywhere. I literally have like bottled waters just sitting here, and sometimes I only finish half of it and I just like leave it there. That shows that we have, we are the rich people of the story whenever we're reading the Bible. And so whenever we look at all these other people being greedy, we have to be like, oh, how are we handling our own money? Because we are the rich people of the story. So he's holding a feast in his house, like the feast of a king, and Nabal's heart was merry within him. Oh, because he heard about what his wife was doing? Oh, no, he didn't even hear about that. He didn't know anything about that story. His heart was merry within him, despite the fact that only hours before he had insulted the number one fugitive of the land who was known for always being able to destroy people. Like, this dude is just oblivious. Like, he insulted the one guy you do not want to insult, and then immediately just goes to a party and acts like nothing's going on. Like, that is very concerning. So, his heart's merry within him, not because he'd been spared or anything. He didn't know about that. It's just because he was drunk. He'd had a lot of wine, probably had some beer. He was having a great time, and he is partying it up with all of his friends and just having a fun time. No idea that he's just been spared his life. Temporarily. So she told him nothing at all until morning light. She got back, and once again, being the discerning woman she is, she's like, probably don't mention this to a drunk guy, either because he won't take the news very well or he just won't remember it in the morning, so then I have to tell the story twice. She just gets back and is like, okay, he's partying again. In the morning, when the wine had gone out of Nabal, right? So he wakes up, he's sober, and he rolls over in bed and has a pounding headache. He's like, man, what happened last night? And she's like, I can tell you what didn't happen last night. You didn't get killed. What do you mean I didn't get killed? Well, yeah, after your stupid decision, David and them, they were about to come kill you, and I went out there and I saved the day. She's telling him all this. In the morning when the wine had gone out of Nabal, his wife told him these things. So she's not hiding it from him. It was just he was too drunk to be told, and so it's not like she was concealing this from him. She's being honest, honey. I just want to let you know what happened. If we're missing some sheep or something, it's because I gave them to David. Even though you didn't allow that. You didn't tell me to. His heart died within him, and he became as a stone. Talk about the definition of greed. He wasn't willing to give anything to somebody who had done something great for him. And despite rejecting somebody in that way, he went on and partied all evening. And the next morning, after a night of merriment and joy, he wakes up and hears that apparently he has lost just a small portion of his possessions, and it scares him and freaks him out so much that his heart becomes like a stone within him. Well, his heart just basically stopped. Like he basically has a heart attack and has a stroke, and it basically seems like just paralyzed. He's just totally still. Talk about greed and hedonism and just the pursuit of pleasure. Like that's what Nabal represents. And so I don't think it's ironic in any way or accidental that his name is Fool, right? This is what happens whenever you pursue the pleasures of the world, right? You're holding on to them with closed fists, and then whenever they're taken from you, you die, right? You realize, oh, apparently I couldn't live without it because your identity was rooted in the things that you possessed. And about 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal and he died. So Nabal still died, but the people of his household didn't, because they hadn't done anything wrong, right? And so rather than David going above and beyond and killing innocent people, the person who was guilty did die. And the story would have been fine if Nabal didn't die. But we see that God is fighting on behalf of David, and God is taking care of David and doing all that stuff. And there's that nice poetic symmetry, right? David was going to do it, and Abigail says, no, God's going to destroy your enemies. And she says, may all your enemies be as Nabal. Well, now that has a whole different definition, doesn't it? Because Nabal is killed by God. Well, may all David's enemies meet the same fate. So Nabal dies. When David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, blessed be the Lord, who has avenged the insult I received at the hand of Nabal, and has kept back his servant from wrongdoing. The Lord has returned the evil of Nabal on his own head. Then David sent and spoke to Abigail to take her as his wife. When the servants of David came to Abigail at Carmel, they said to her, David has sent us to take you to him as his wife. And she rose and bowed with her face to the ground and said, behold your handmaid. Your handmaid is a servant to wash the feet of the servants of my Lord. And Abigail hurried and rose and mounted a donkey, and her 5 young women attended her. She followed the messengers of David and became his wife. I love that story. So what happens?
David marries Abigail
Yeah, David marries Abigail.
after the foolishness of Nabal.
Yeah, I think it's a really sweet story. I just think it's really cool. So David hears that Nabal's dead, and the first thing he does is he blesses God, right? And it's not, notice he's not blessing God simply because he got what he wanted and Nabal's dead. He's viewing it in a sense of justice and grace. He says, blessed be God for avenging me, right? So, he's saying Nabal did do something wrong, and he deserved, honestly, it's good that guy is out of the picture, because he was just not helping out the community at all. But also for keeping me from doing that, who has kept his servant from wrongdoing. That's really interesting, right? So whenever, a lot of the times we don't like it if somebody rebukes us and tries to get on to us about sin, but really that's an opportunity to praise God. Thank God for putting somebody in my life who is willing to love me enough to call me out of my sin and stop me from sinning. That's a totally different perspective, you know? Rather than getting all defensive and be like, hey, who are you to judge? Judge not lest ye be judged. Right? Start quoting that out of context. No, instead, we say, praise be to God. Like, thank you, God, for giving me a person like Sean who's willing to just call me on my crap and, and just, tell me whenever I need to get my act together. Like, that's cool. And that's what a man after God's own heart does, right? He responds appropriately when called out for his sin. We're going to see the same characteristic of David after the Bathsheba thing. Whenever David is called out, he immediately repents. And so despite all that he's doing, like, David's going to respond well. Were you raising your hand about something?
No.
Oh, okay. So David hears that Nabal's dead. He says, blessed be the Lord, who avenged the insult I received at the hand of Nabal, and has kept back his servant from wrongdoing. The Lord has returned the evil of Nabal on his own head. Returned the evil, right? We have that same language, right? And we saw the same thing in the last chapter. Whenever David stood before Saul, he said, hey, I'm not going to repay you evil, but God can judge between me and you. David says, hey, God can do what he wants. If God wants to rain evil upon you, so be it. If God wants you to be punished, cool. But I am not going to take justice into my own hands. And so David learned that same lesson again. That's also really reassuring because it also kind of tells us a little bit about like the whole backsliding idea, Sometimes it's like I will respond to a situation in the appropriate manner, and then the next time I'm confronted by that same situation, I will respond in the most sinful manner possible. Well, apparently David did the exact same thing. He was confronted by the same thing twice. The first time, he did it right. Second time, he didn't. And he's saying, you know what? I learned my lesson, and apparently that's okay. It's not like they were two totally different scenarios. He says, no. The first time, I did it really well. In a much more extreme scenario, this time I didn't do it well. But both times taught me the same thing. God will ultimately fulfill his promises, and God will take care of it. I just need to let God do that. Then David sent and spoke to Abigail to take her as his wife. Because what did she ask him to do whenever God had fulfilled all that he had promised to David? Don't forget me. And David recognizes that this amazing, beautiful, discerning woman is now a widow. And it doesn't matter how rich you are, to be a widow at that time period, not a good thing. And so he reaches out to her and says, hey, will you be my wife? Honestly, this is one of those ones, I want a Hallmark movie of it. Even though Hallmark movies are just trash when it comes to theology, but they're not Christian movies anyway, so it's fine. But I don't know, it feels very romantic to me, right? It's just such a great story. He spoke to Abigail to take her as his wife. When the servants of David came to Abigail at Carmel, they said to her, David has sent us to you to take you to him as his wife. So they sent to Abigail and they're like, hey, is this something that you would want? Would you like to become David's bride? Now that the fool is out of the way, would you like to become the wife of beloved? That's what David means. And she rose and bowed with her face to the ground. So immediately, even before she's speaking, you know what her response is, right? She's humbling herself and submitting. And said, behold, your handmaid is a servant to wash the feet of the servants of my Lord. This is just a humble girl, right? After all that's gone on, you'd think that she'd be like, yeah, I'm not surprised that he wants to marry me. I'm awesome. She's not doing that. Instead, she bows down before the servants of David. And keep in mind, they're all still fugitives right now. So the servants of David are still not really like, they probably got some pretty nasty feet. They've been living in the desert. And she says, washing somebody's feet is like the lowliest thing you can do as a servant, right? By the time you get to Jesus' time period, that was reserved for the lowest servant. And she says, hey, behold, your handmaid is a servant to wash the feet of the servants of my Lord. So she's like, let me wash your feet. She's just saying, whatever you want me to do, I will do. If you want me to wash your feet, I'll wash your feet. She's humbling herself and just really amazing girl. And Abigail hurried and rose and mounted a donkey, and her 5 young women attended her. Once again, rich household. She's got 5 women coming with. But she hurries, right? She doesn't waste any time. As soon as David sends for her, she hurries and gets everybody together, and she's going to go do this. She followed the messengers of David and became his wife. She leaves everything and follows David. Kind of like the apostles, Leave everything, follow Jesus. She says, hey, whatever you want. Okay, guys, women, grab donkeys, let's go. And they leave. And they go to be with David. But we have an issue. What's the issue?
He's already married.
David is technically already married. And while technically there is no explicit command in the Bible that says polygamy is it's not allowed, is very clear within the Bible that God's standard is monogamy, right? As in one man, one woman. It's very clear that is God's intention, and he says that kings are not supposed to have multiple wives. And so you're like, this is problematic. David, you just got out of one issue. You already have a wife. Her name is Michal, remember? But this is where the author is going to play a bait and switch with us and try to reassure us momentarily. David also took Ahinoam of Jezreel, and both of them became his wives. Saul had given Michal, his daughter, David's wife, to Palti the son of Laish, who was of Galim. So verse 44 should kind of make us feel a bit better about the situation, right? Because here David's like, okay, I'm going to marry Abigail, and they clarify, oh, well, technically David didn't have his other wife anymore. Because technically, now that David's on the run, Saul had actually taken David's wife and given her to somebody else. And so technically, Abigail was David's first wife. Oh, okay, that's fine. All right. Whew. Man, I thought David was doing something sinful again. But then you got to go back to verse 43. David also took Ahinoam of Jezreel, and both of them became his wives. Ah, darn. Okay, so maybe David isn't as clean as we thought, right? So it's like, okay, so on a technicality, marrying Abigail, that's all right, technically, because, I mean, it's not like there was an official divorce between David and Michal, but, I mean, she's married to another person now, so I guess we'll let that one slide. So marrying Abigail's fine. But then he marries another girl. It's like, oh no. What does this tell us about David?
He's human.
Well, he's human, but also
Problem with women.
he's got a problem with women. Put that in the back of your head. It's going to come back to really bite him in the butt later on in the story. But also at the same time, we have to realize that as David's doing this, it's showing the difficulty of, once again, morality for godly people, even men after God's own heart. Because guess what? In this culture, it was common for men of authority to have multiple wives, right? And you could see especially, I mean, this was an issue like with slavery in like America and stuff, where people would land on both ends of, is slavery good or bad, during like whenever we were wrestling through that, because there's no explicit command in the Bible that outlaws slavery. I mean, whenever you read the Bible, and if you're reading it correctly, it's very clear that God's ideal is that slavery should not exist, right? All of the things about slavery are all talking about, hey, be gentle towards slaves and love them. And then like Philemon, Paul's like, hey, I think you should welcome your slave back as a brother, confident that you'll do that, and even more, I'll come see you soon. Like, it's very clear that the Bible is like, okay, yeah, slavery, not ideal, but it never outlaws it. And so whenever people were wrestling through slavery in America and stuff, Christians landed on both ends. Some of them were defending it, some of them were going against it. Same thing with polygamy. There's never a clear command that says you can't have multiple wives. It suggests that kings shouldn't, and so David should know better than that. But there's never a clear command there, and so, you know, everybody else in our culture has multiple wives. Sure, why not? And so you realize that David doing this, it's not like in his own mind, he probably isn't thinking, ooh, let me violate the commands of God. He's probably just overlooking the clear teaching of Scripture based on cultural standards, right? And I think that's something that we also deal with nowadays. Maybe we're not wrestling through polygamy or slavery, but there's plenty of other things that probably 300 years from now, people are going to look back at our culture and be like, guys, that was evident in Scripture. But we justify things just because that's how our culture does them, right? And I wish that I could give you specific examples, but if I could, then that would kind of defeat the whole point of what I'm saying. Because there's probably plenty of stuff that we're just not even aware of that is pretty much against the Bible, but it's just so ingrained into our culture that we don't even notice the discrepancy there. And so I think that's what we see here about David. He's a man after God's own heart, but he's also a man. And even the best man is only a man at best, right? And so he is a really good, godly guy, but he's also a guy living in a sinful, broken world, and he is one of those sinful, broken people. And so he's going to do things that aren't always the godliest thing. And for us, we're like we look at this, and even the author, I mean, the reason why the author mentions this here is because he's trying to highlight that things are not all good in David land. But at the moment, David probably wasn't thinking anything of this. I can almost guarantee you that we don't know the story of how he met Ahinoam of Jezreel, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was a very similar scenario, right? Where maybe he helped her out in some way, maybe her husband ended up dying, or maybe she was a widow or something, and he took her in, right? Maybe he was trying to provide for her, and he could justify that. And you say, you know what, it's better for you to be married with me than to be a widow. Let's just welcome you in. But it still violates God's standard, right? And so that's what we have to be aware of, and poor Solomon, he's apparently not going to learn any lessons from his dad's failure, because Solomon's going to have 700 wives and 300 concubines. And you're like, oh, yikes. Yeah, so sometimes sins kind of just keep getting worse as time passes. But yeah, so there's that chapter. I really think it's a fun chapter. Do y'all have any comments to make before we really just wrap this up? It was a long chapter. I wish we could have gone more in depth, honestly. To me, it felt like we were just blasting through it. To y'all are probably like, nah, that dragged on forever. But any comments, concerns, humorous anecdotes? Yeah.
Would you want to go in more detail though?
All of it. Here's the thing. So back whenever we were going through the Gospel of John, for some of y'all might remember that, we would literally spend 2 hours covering 8 verses. That is my favorite way to study the Bible. The issue is that meeting once a week, you just really can't do that, because by the time you finish the whole story, you forgot the story itself. And so I would love, honestly, the thing that I would love to have focused on more is Abigail's speech, just because I think you could literally just break that down word by word. And this is just a woman if David is a man after God's own heart, Abigail's a woman after God's own heart. And I think that's really a cool thing that we see about David. He's usually at his best when he's surrounded by other people who are of the same heart. So whenever he's around Jonathan, whenever he's around Abigail, these people encourage David to be the man who God created him to be. And I just think that's really encouraging from a perspective of Christian community, because technically, you can live the Christian life in isolation, kind of, other than the fact that Jesus did say that they'll know you're my disciples by your love for one another. And so technically, in order to demonstrate that you are a disciple of Christ, you do need to be surrounded by other Christians to love. But, if you're just saying, you can place your faith in Christ and you can live a godly life without any other Christians around you. But whenever you are surrounded by fellow people who also want to honor God above all else, it really helps out a whole lot. And we see that with David. I just love this. I would love to analyze, honestly, I'm just going to say I want to analyze all of it, because I would love to analyze David's response there, because the way that he responds to her rebuke is beautiful, and I wish that I could respond to people's rebukes that elegantly. And I don't know, just all of it. More the narrative stuff, which is typically the things that I love to just break down, that stuff actually takes the back seat for me, and really it's the dialogue that I love in this chapter. Just with all of it. I would love to break down just Nabal's response, and then how Abigail describes her husband. All of that stuff is just very, very good, and I would love to spend a lot deeper in that. But you can do that on your own time. Real quick, application-wise, I've already addressed a few things. Are there any other application-styled things that y'all can think of in this chapter? Then we'll just pray and wrap up. Rocky is head shaking no. Anybody want a head shake yes? What's that?
Overall, where does it fit in as a summary from Genesis to?
Where does the story fit in?
God, Abraham,
where does the story fit in?
No, a short summary of Genesis to
Oh, you want me to give a summary?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
I thought the shortest one you had was 6 or 7 points, where it was God, and then.
I can summarize the whole story of the Bible in 7 words.
That's what I meant.
God's commitment to dwelling with man again.
Yes.
And if you're trying to figure out where the David story fits into that, it is probably one of the most crucial moments of all of this. Because, really, Abraham was very crucial, right? Because God chooses Abraham and says, okay, through you, I'm going to create this special people, and through that special people, I'm going to bring the world back to me. Okay, well, David is one of the most key figures in that entire story. Because with David, eventually we're going to get there where God says, through you, that promised person is going to come. Right? To where you're going to have an eternal dynasty, and all the idea that there's this Messiah figure, that starts with David. Whenever Jesus shows up, he is called Son of David. And there's a lot to that title, both when it comes to just his lineage, but also his character. David is one of the most influential human beings on the face of the planet, which is just crazy if you think about it. And that's why even what Abigail says here, it's very crucial, because David was a man after God's own heart. And it's important for somebody to step in there and say, hey, David, God has got something really big planned in you. And this is really the first place in the Bible where we have somebody telling David, God is going to build you a house. And she says, a sure house. Right? And so really that is a promise, ultimately, about Jesus. And that's really the first time we get that. And so technically this is very crucial in the whole God dwelling with man again.
Yeah.
I mean, this is absolutely necessary. Because David is really being called to, like he is, prior to Jesus, David is kind of the standard of godliness. Every king after him, when you get to the books of Kings and Chronicles, they're going to be compared to David. And it's going to say, they followed in the footsteps of their father David, and they looked neither left nor right. Or it's going to say, they did not follow in the footsteps of their father David. And so up until you get to Jesus, David is the standard bearer of righteousness. And so having Abigail come up and say, hey, don't do something you're going to regret, very important, because he is the standard until Jesus arrives. And then Jesus arrives and says, let me make that standard a little bit higher. And it's going to be total perfection. But yeah, so that actually is very crucial in the whole meta-narrative of Scripture, the David story.
And what about
There's a reason so much, like, David is the character that we know most about in all of Scripture, even more than Jesus. There is not really another person I can think of off the top of my head who we literally know about his entire life. Whereas David, we know about him in his youth, we know about him in his teenage years, we know about him as a young adult, we know about him as an early king, middle-aged king, and we see him all the way to his deathbed.
The Psalms.
Yeah, and the Psalms, right? We get like his insight to the world. Like David is the person, we know more about him than any other character in Scripture, because he is very crucial.
does prophecy fit in? Because I thought prophecy was before Jesus, but then also Genesis, would that be prophesying him? Like, what's the connection from prophets?
Yeah.
Point.
Lion shall come from the tribe of Judah, right? A lot of prophecies are, some of them point towards David, but they also flow from David. A lot of the prophecies that are going to come afterwards, a shoot shall rise from the stump of Jesse, right? There's going to be this Messiah figure who shows up from the line of David. O Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are small amongst the clans of Judah, from you will come one who is mighty, right? And so David is super crucial. That's why we spend so much time with him. I mean, the book of like Chronicles, Samuel, Kings, all of this revolves around the David story, which is just, if you think about that, pretty crazy. Given that Jesus, we only know of a little bit about his birth, a little bit of, like, one story about his teenage years, and then we have 3.5 years of his life. And people have kind of calculated it, and if you take all the different stories from the Gospels, some people say that it accounts for about 54 days of Christ's ministry, which is crazy, because he is the most significant person in the entire world. And with David, we actually have a lot more information there. So, very important figure. But any application things? Yes.
One of the things that kind of stuck out to me was how what you're talking about with looking kind of immoral with Abigail, like going behind her husband's back a little bit, not informing him about what she was doing.
Yeah.
Was the fact that, like, when you're reading the story, it doesn't really present him, Nabal, as like, oh yeah, she really shouldn't have done that. It was like, okay, that was a wise decision. And like, for the people in the story, for all of the servants, they were like, we are going to go to Abigail and figure out how to get stuff done.
I like how everybody
she's not-
inherently knew
Yeah.
Abigail will know how to
Yeah.
take care of this.
Well,
Yeah.
she's like the wise, discerning one. But even the people who aren't described as that, even the random, like, unnamed servants, are like, we're in a really bad situation and need to go to the wise person to, like, figure out how to solve it.
Yes.
And it Nabal is like completely oblivious the entire time.
Yeah.
And like what you're talking about, he's just having a party. And that's where it's like when you're trying to think of how to not be Nabal, it's like, how do you know if you're not even aware of any of this whole story that happened until it's like you're dead already? And I think that's where it pairs well with the Proverbs.
Yeah.
It's like, get wisdom. So as long as you're just like constantly trying to make sure you're having that, walking that out, and seeking more of it.
Don't be afraid to ask others for help.
Yeah.
Yeah. The beginning of wisdom, get wisdom.
Yeah, I've wondered about that a lot too. Like, get wisdom before you need it. Like, but I don't know I need it till if I have it. Then,
Well, that's the
I
issue,
think it's
right?
like-
That's where we need to be discerning enough to pay attention to our surroundings, so we're not like Nabal, and we just wake up one morning and we're like, "How did I get myself in this situation?" No, try to be discerning enough to figure out, yeah, you know what? Maybe we need a more we need to seek wisdom in this.
And two, I forgot to mention it, but the first step to like actually fixing and like having Abigail fix the situation wasn't anything Abigail did. It was the servant that's like, we need to get the information relayed to her.
Yeah.
And it's like, he wasn't remarked as wise, whoever that servant was, but they brought that to the wise person.
That's actually a really crucial point. I'm actually glad you mentioned that because we didn't mention this at all. The servant is one of the heroes in this because if he had never brought that information to Abigail, Abigail would not have shown up and saved the day. Abigail would have never known about this. She would have woken up the next morning and everybody in the house would have been murdered. And she'd be like, what happened? So the servant plays a very crucial role there, which if you're talking about application, maybe sometimes we're not called to be the hero of the story. Maybe sometimes we're just supposed to be the person who realizes there's a problem and takes it to somebody wiser, right? And that doesn't make you any less significant. If anything, it makes you even more crucial. Because you realize I can't handle the situation in and of myself, but I think I know somebody who can. And so there's humility. Like the servant didn't, just disobey and go do it. No, they still took it to Abigail and said, hey, you're going to know how to handle this better than I do. So there is probably some humility and wisdom even in that. So I'm glad you mentioned that because we had not even talked about the servant, but if the servant hadn't recognized that they didn't know how to handle the situation, David probably would have done all the wrong things. And so God used a person who was willing to admit, I need help. So that's very good. Cool. All right. Anybody else? All right. I'm going to close this out in prayer. It is 9:10. Wow, these are just going longer and longer. This was a long chapter, though, okay? I'm going to try not to make them this long. And it was also a really exciting chapter. Okay. Dear Lord, thank you so much for allowing us to be here today. I pray that we will not just allow your word to go in one ear and out the other, but that we'll actually apply it and that we'll appreciate it, and that through this study we will desire you more, and that we'll desire to be closer to you than ever before, and that we'll love you more and love others more. Help us learn to be more like David in his successes and less like David in his failures. But even amidst our failures, God, help us learn to respond like David when you discipline us or send somebody to stop us from being stupid. We love you, God. We thank you for who you are. We thank you for providing us your word to help make you known. Help us go out into the world and be part of the solution that this world needs. In your name we pray. Amen.